On the morning of June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sailed through open ocean about 200 miles northwest of a speck of coral called Midway. They were the heart of the Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike force on Earth. In 6 months of war, these same ships had smashed Pearl Harbor, terrorized the coast of Australia, raided Ceylon, and sunk Allied vessels from Hawaii to the Java Sea. They had never lost, not once. Their crews shaved, ate rice, and readied their planes that morning, expecting another easy day of killing. They had no idea that 3 American carriers were already sitting in the empty sea to the northeast, engines quiet, decks loaded, waiting for them. Within roughly 5 minutes that morning, 3 of those 4 Japanese carriers would be torn open and set ablaze. By nightfall, the 4th would be gone too. Japan would lose 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men in a single day, including hundreds of the most experienced naval aviators in the world.
It was the day the Pacific War turned, and it never turned back. So how did a smaller, outgunned American fleet, still bleeding from Pearl Harbor and outnumbered in nearly every category that mattered, manage to ambush and destroy the finest carrier force on the planet? The answer does not begin with a ship or a plane. It begins in a hot, windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, with a small group of exhausted men reading other people's mail. In the spring of 1942, the war was going badly for the United States, catastrophically badly. Pearl Harbor on December 7th had crippled the American battleship fleet in under 2 hours. In the months that followed, the Japanese took the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. They captured tens of thousands of Allied prisoners. They seemed unstoppable, because so far they had been. The one piece of luck the Americans had was that their 3 Pacific aircraft carriers had been out at sea on December 7th and survived.
3 carriers, that was the thin line standing between Japan and total control of the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood this perfectly. He knew the carriers were the real prize, and he knew the United States was a sleeping giant that would only grow stronger with time. Yamamoto wanted one more decisive battle. He wanted to lure the surviving American carriers into open water and finish them off while Japan still held the advantage. His target was Midway, a 2-island atoll guarding the approach to Hawaii. Take Midway, and he could threaten Hawaii itself. More importantly, an attack on Midway would force the American carriers to come out and fight. That was the real plan. Midway was the bait. The plan was enormous and on paper overwhelming. Yamamoto committed more than 150 ships, including 8 carriers of various types, 11 battleships, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers stretched across hundreds of miles of ocean. The striking core was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first air fleet, 4 big fleet carriers named Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These 4 ships and their veteran air crews had led every major Japanese victory of the war. Against them, the Americans could put to sea 3 carriers at most, and one of those was wounded. There was just one problem with Yamamoto's masterpiece. The Americans already knew it was coming. Down in that basement at Pearl Harbor, a unit called Station HYPO had been grinding away at the main Japanese naval code, a cipher the Americans called JN-25. The man running it was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a thin, intense officer who worked 20-hour days in a red smoking jacket and slippers over his uniform because the room was freezing from the cooling needed for the machines. His team never fully broke the code. They could read maybe 10 to 15% of any given message. But Rochefort had something a codebook cannot give you.
He had spent years studying the Japanese Navy, he spoke the language, and he could feel the shape of an operation forming out of fragments. By May, Rochefort was certain a massive operation was coming, and that its objective was a place the Japanese messages kept calling AF. He was sure AF meant Midway. Washington was not. Some senior officers thought the real target might be the Aleutians or even the West Coast. The argument mattered enormously because Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, could not defend everywhere at once. Guess wrong, and he would send his only carriers steaming in exactly the wrong direction. So Rochefort's team set a trap inside the trap. They had the garrison at Midway send a radio message in plain, uncoded English announcing that the island's water distillation plant had broken down and that it was short of fresh water. It was bait, and it was pure invention. 2 days later, American listening posts intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. That settled it. AF was Midway. The argument was over. Think about what that meant. The single greatest advantage in warfare is knowing what your enemy will do before he does it. Nimitz now knew the target, he knew the rough date, and he had a good picture of the forces coming at him. Yamamoto's entire plan depended on surprising the Americans and catching their carriers scattered and unready. Instead, the Americans were about to surprise him. If you were enjoying this breakdown of how the battle was really won, take a second to subscribe. We cover the strategy, deception, and decisive moments of military history every week, and the next few minutes are where everything comes apart for the Japanese. Nimitz moved fast. He recalled his carriers from the South Pacific. Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, was supposed to be led by Admiral William Halsey, but Halsey was in the hospital with a severe skin condition. He recommended a cruiser commander named Raymond Spruance to take his place. It was one of the most important substitutions in American military history. Spruance was calm, careful, and ruthless with numbers. Task Force 17, built around the carrier Yorktown, was led by Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who held overall tactical command. The Yorktown was the problem. She had been badly damaged a month earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier battle in history, where two flat tops traded blows without ever seeing each other. Engineers estimated she needed 3 months in dry dock. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. More than 1,000 workers swarmed over the ship around the clock at Pearl Harbor, welding, patching, and shoring up her wounded hull while she sat in the dock. She steamed out to fight in under 3 days, still trailing repair crews who finished their work at sea. That single decision gave Nimitz a third flight deck he was not supposed to have. The Americans took up a position northeast of Midway and waited. They named the spot Point Luck. They were hiding off the flank of the route the Japanese carriers would have to take, close enough to strike, far enough to stay hidden. The trap was set. The hunters thought they were the hunted, and they were sailing straight into it. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway itself. 108 aircraft roared off his 4 decks to bomb the island's defenses. It was a routine opening move, and it went reasonably well. But the strike leader radioed back a fateful message. A second attack on the island would be needed to finish the job. That recommendation set in motion the decision that would destroy the Japanese fleet. Here's the situation Nagumo now faced, and it is the hinge the entire battle turns on. He had kept roughly half his aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. After the message from Midway, he ordered those reserve planes to be rearmed with regular bombs for a second strike on the island. Crews began hauling the torpedoes off and bolting on land attack bombs. It was slow, heavy, dangerous work. And then, in the middle of it, a Japanese scout plane sent a report that froze the blood of every officer on the flagship. American ships, to the northeast. The carriers Nagumo did not believe were anywhere near him were right on top of him. Now he had a terrible choice. His reserve planes were half rearmed with the wrong weapons for attacking ships. His first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel, and needed to land. He could launch a ragged, half-ready attack immediately, or he could wait, recover his returning planes, properly rearm everything for ships, and hit the Americans with one perfectly coordinated hammer blow. Nagumo chose to wait and do it right. It was the correct doctrine. It was also the worst possible decision, because it meant that for a crucial stretch of the morning, all 4 Japanese carrier decks were a chaos of refueling hoses, stacked bombs, swapped torpedoes, and aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip. The most flammable, most fragile condition a carrier can be in. The ships were floating bombs waiting for a match. Meanwhile, the American carriers were already launching everything they had. The first to arrive were the torpedo bombers, and what happened to them is one of the most heartbreaking acts of courage in the war. The American torpedo planes were obsolete, slow Douglas Devastators. They had to fly low and straight to drop their torpedoes, which made them easy targets. They arrived ahead of their own dive bombers and without fighter protection. Torpedo Squadron 8, off the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, went in first. All 15 planes were shot down.
Of the 30 men in that squadron, 29 died. One man, Ensign George Gay, survived by hiding under a floating seat cushion, watching the rest of the battle from the water. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise attacked next and was butchered. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown followed and was nearly wiped out as well.
In total, of roughly 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 came back. They scored not a single hit. By every measure on paper, it was a slaughter and a failure. But it was not a failure. It was the most important thing that happened all day. To shoot down those low, slow torpedo planes, the Japanese fighters, the Deadly Zeros, flying combat patrol above the fleet, had to dive down to wave-top height, every one of them. And while those Zeros were down on the deck chasing torpedo bombers and burning through fuel and ammunition, the sky above the Japanese carriers, the high sky, was left wide open, completely undefended. The torpedo squadrons had died, and in dying they had pulled the entire Japanese fighter screen down to sea level at the exact moment it was needed most. High above, almost out of fuel, a flight of American dive bombers was searching for the enemy. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had flown to where the Japanese were supposed to be and found empty ocean.
He was running low on fuel and could have turned for home. Instead, he kept searching, and he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer cutting a white wake across the sea at high speed. He guessed, correctly, that it was racing to rejoin the carriers. He followed it like an arrow pointing home. It led him straight to the Kido Butai. What McClusky saw when he arrived overhead was every dive bomber pilot's dream. 4 carriers, decks packed with fueled and armed planes, and not a single enemy fighter between him and them. At nearly the same moment, dive bombers from the Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie arrived over a 3rd carrier. The Americans pushed over into their dives almost together, screaming down out of the high sun. What followed took about 5 minutes. The first bombs hit the Kaga, punching through her wooden flight deck and exploding among the fueled armed planes and the loose ordnance below. She erupted. Then the Akagi, Nagumo's own flagship, took a bomb almost dead center in her packed hangar. The explosions tore her apart from the inside as her own bombs and aviation fuel detonated in a chain. A few miles away, the Soryu took 3 hits in quick succession and became a furnace within minutes. 3 of the 4 best carriers in the Japanese Navy, the ships that had run wild across half the world for 6 months, were mortally wounded before lunch. Nagumo had to be talked into abandoning his burning flagship. 4 carriers, 1 morning, 3 already dying. Only the Hiryu was left, and her crew fought back hard. She launched 2 desperate counterstrikes that afternoon and found the Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes pushed through the American defenses and hit the Yorktown again and again, knocking out her engines and leaving her dead in the water. Listing so badly her crew was ordered to abandon ship. For a few hours, the Japanese aboard the Hiryu believed they had sunk 2 American carriers and might still salvage the day.
They were wrong. The damage had come from one ship, the Yorktown, hit twice and mistaken for 2. Late that same afternoon, American dive bombers found the Hiryu, the last carrier, alone. They hit her with 4 bombs and turned her into the same burning wreck as her 3 sisters. By the early hours of June 5th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers had either sunk or been scuttled. The Kido Butai, the spear point of the Japanese Empire, simply ceased to exist. The Yorktown refused to die quietly. American crews actually reboarded her and were fighting to save the listing carrier when a Japanese submarine, the I-168, slipped through the screen and put torpedoes into her and into the destroyer Hammond tied alongside. The Hammond sank in minutes. The Yorktown held on through the night and finally rolled over and sank on the morning of June 7th. She was the only American carrier lost in the battle. When the smoke cleared, the numbers told a story that barely seemed possible.
Japan lost all 4 fleet carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, 248 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men. The United States lost the Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, about 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The Japanese had sailed to Midway with the strongest hand in the Pacific. They sailed home having lost the war's most important battle in a matter of hours. And the deepest wound was not the steel. Ships can be rebuilt, and America was about to build them faster than anyone in history. The wound that never healed was the men.
Japan lost hundreds of veteran pilots and thousands of irreplaceable mechanics and aircrew, the people who had trained for years and could not be replaced in months. Japan's naval flight schools could never refill that gap. From that day forward, Japanese carrier aviation was a declining force, and American carrier aviation only grew. Step back and look at what actually beat the Japanese at Midway, because it was not raw strength. The Japanese had more carriers, more planes, more experience, and better aircraft.
They lost anyway. They lost because the Americans knew the target before the first shot, thanks to a freezing basement and a fake message about drinking water. They lost because a wounded carrier was patched up in 3 days instead of 3 months. They lost because doomed torpedo squadrons dragged the enemy fighters down to the sea and bought the dive bombers a clear sky with their lives. And they lost because one officer, low on fuel, chose to keep looking and followed a single destroyer to the enemy. It is the same lesson that runs through almost every upset in military history. Yamamoto built a plan so complicated and so confident that it left no room for the enemy to do anything he did not expect. He assumed surprise. He assumed the Americans would react late and scatter. He built a trap, and he never once considered that he might be the one walking into it. The Americans took his greatest strength, his certainty, and turned it into the lever that broke him.
Yamamoto reportedly spent the rest of the war haunted by Midway. The Japanese government hid the scale of the defeat from its own people, treating the wounded sailors almost as prisoners to keep the news from spreading. The 4 carriers were quietly struck from the Navy lists. The Empire kept fighting for 3 more brutal years, but it never again held the initiative in the Pacific. Every island the Americans took afterward, every fleet they built, every battle that followed, traced back to a single morning off a tiny coral atoll where the math of the entire war flipped in 5 minutes. The waters around Midway are quiet now. The carriers lie miles down in the dark, found only recently by deep-sea expeditions that filmed their broken hulls resting on the ocean floor. The atoll itself is a wildlife refuge today, home to more albatrosses than people. It is easy to forget that this empty patch of the Pacific hosted the battle that decided the largest naval war in human history.
The men who flew those torpedo bombers knew the odds. They went in anyway. The codebreakers who never got famous won a battle from a basement. And a single decision to keep searching, made by a tired pilot watching his fuel gauge, changed the course of a world war. If this kind of breakdown is what you came for, the moment a battle turns on one choice, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We have a lot more of these to tell, and they only get more incredible from here.